So welcome to the Chartered Institute of Linguists presentation on international language standards. So the first thing to say is that for the Chartered Institute of Linguists, language standards are very, very important to our work. They're an important part of our support for language professionals and also encouragement to linguists of all levels, because they give a framework of reference so people can see how their language skills compare to others and how their language skills will be practically useful in various different contexts and circumstances. So we have published on our website CIOL's language level frameworks, which cover the sorts of expectations and level of linguistic skill that you might see at professional level. So that would be someone who might be a translator or an interpreter, or working at a very, very high level in international organizations. And of course, people who teach or study and research languages in universities. Then we would have guidance on the sorts of levels of skill that you would see at a working level, someone who uses their languages from time to time or as part of their job. And then also the sorts of language skills that you would have if you were learning a new language or had basic levels of language skill that enabled you to be reasonably autonomous in an international context or in a non-native language context, but possibly and in some circumstances needing some support. So those frameworks are set out very clearly on our website on CIOL language level frameworks on the www.ciol.org.uk website, and I recommend everyone have a look at those. So into the actual standards that exist around the world, probably the one that most people will come across first would be the Common European Framework of Reference, or the CEFR. And the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages is about learning, about teaching and assessment of languages, and it was designed to provide transparent, coherent and comprehensive bases for working out language syllabuses, for working out curriculums, and then for designing teaching and learning materials, and then finally assessing people's proficiency in languages. So it's widely used in teacher education. It was widely used and is still used to work on language curricula, and it's very, very useful for the comparability of qualifications as well. So the CEFR was created by the Council of Europe in the late 1980s and early 1990s. It's very, very well known, and it has 6 reference letter levels, which we'll come to in a moment. A1, which is the lowest level, A2, B1, B2, and C1, C2, C2 being the highest level of linguistic competence in the CEFR. Important to recognize, and we'll come back to this later on in the presentation, that the CEFR is not just about language and education, it's also a European cultural and citizenship project. So it is founded on the belief that a greater ability to speak languages actually supports cultural and citizenship objectives as well as linguistic objectives. So it's a very ambitious program. So more on the CEFR levels, and of course there is comprehensive information available on this on the Council of Europe website. So basically A1 and A2 are the levels of basic user, so can maybe understand some familiar expressions, can maybe articulate some important and useful terms that would enable you to navigate at a basic level in another language. B1 and B2 are the levels of independent user, so that's the point where someone starts to become autonomous in a language. B1, that would be a basic level, and B2, a more advanced level, a B2 independent user will have a good degree of fluency and a good capacity to navigate contexts and situations. And then up to the levels which we would associate more with professional linguists, C1, which is having a very strong ability in languages, and this would be the level which would be the beginning for teaching, for academic study, for translation and interpreting work, and this is the level that a lot of CIOL's qualifications are targeted at. And then the highest level in the CEFR, C2, which is effectively can understand and can deal with any situation. So that's the CEFR framework, and as I say, much more on that on the Council of Europe website. A more simplified view of this might be to think of the sort of level that a preschooler might have being A1, the sort of level that someone might develop in primary education being A2, secondary level language skills kicking into B1, post-secondary and university B2, and then on to C1 for people who achieve a high standard of communicative competence at university. And certainly, if you're looking around the world, most people who are looking at the proficiency level they would seek from an English language teacher, for example, they would be looking for C1 level skills. So that's the more simplified view of the CEFR. In the detailed guidance which goes around this, there are very, very comprehensive descriptors which describe exactly what you might expect someone to be able to do at a given level. And this, for an illustration, is on written production. So what you would expect a person to be able to produce at A1 level, so basic information about matters of personal relevance, so maybe names and basic expressions, up to C2, which is clear, smoothly flowing, complex texts in an appropriate and effective style. So you can see on that slide the range of different expectations that you might see in the CEFR for written production, and in the comprehensive guidance, all aspects from reading, from writing, from speaking and listening, all the aspects are covered, including negotiation and mediation and presentation skills, and what sorts of levels would be associated with them. So it's a very comprehensive framework. And here is indeed the latest version of that comprehensive framework, which was refreshed in 2020 and now has a searchable directory of descriptors. It also has things to do with more advanced adaptation and implementation of the CEFR in national context. So it's a very, very comprehensive framework. But there are others. So to look at other frameworks which might be encountered around the world, there is the ILR, which is the Interagency Language Roundtable Framework, and this comes from the US and is very well established there. The related spin-off from that, which is STANAG 6001, which is a similar framework, in fact the identical framework really, used by NATO and armed forces. And then you also have the UN has a framework which has a lot of similarity with the NATO and ILR frameworks. And what's noticeable about these frameworks is they generally have a 1 to 4 or a 1 to 5 level. So 1 being the lowest level, 4 being a high level, and then 5 for the two frameworks that have 5 as being the very, very highest level, which is effectively native proficiency or fluency. And the ILR was set up some years ago, basically began in the 1950s as part of the United States international engagement and seeking to coordinate federal agencies and other parts of US government which engage with international actors. So it's been around for a long time, very, very well established, and actually is very straightforward to understand and use. So it's a useful framework. So just to say a little bit more about what's in the ILR, so as previously, a 5-point scale. What's interesting about the ILR is that it also has plus levels. So in effect, if 0 is no proficiency and 1 is elementary proficiency, there's also a recognition of intermediate steps. So 1+, 2+, 3+. And just to pause on 3+ for a moment, because 3+, broadly speaking, maps onto B2 C1 in the CEFR level. So the level that starts to be certainly someone who's autonomous and has good fluency and can do professional work in languages. What's interesting at ILR is that 3+ is a language level which is quite often sought in contexts where the ILR is used. So that's the onset of professional capability, and then 4 is safely into C1, C2 levels, which are again the levels that we would associate with language professionals. And then just to pull out 5, functionally native proficiency. So that is someone, it's C2 or beyond, that is someone who is effectively bilingual and has almost native proficiency, well, actually native proficiency in a language. And that's the reason, as we'll come on to, probably why the United Nations doesn't use that level, because they're focusing more on practical use. So some other useful features of the ILR, really helpfully, it subdivides the skills of listening, speaking, reading and writing and gives candidates or test takers a score on each of the 5. So you get a 4-digit score. So as an illustration here, 3, 3, 3 plus 4. So that would be someone who has good listening, good speaking, really very good reading, and excellent writing skills. So it gives a slightly more detailed articulation of people's individual skills. And this is quite important because very many linguists will have strengths and weaknesses across listening, speaking, reading, and writing, depending on the way that someone may have picked up their languages. They could be very, very strong orally and less confident in writing, or alternatively, for example, someone who may have picked up a lot of their languages in an academic context, they may be very confident in reading and writing, but perhaps slightly less confident in speaking and listening. And the other point, of course, is that for people who aren't using their languages every day, their language skills can deteriorate over time. So while someone may at one time have been very confident in speaking, if they've been 10 years away from a country or a language context, that confidence can drift and that fluency can drift as well. So the ILR helpfully enables you to very readily see where you are as a person, and also show to an employer or someone who might be interested where your strengths and weaknesses lie. So everyone's clear where you're strong and where you're less confident. ILR also has specific frameworks for translators and interpreters and specific descriptors, which are illustrated on the page, and they're quite useful, particularly for the sort of work that CIOL does to articulate more clearly what translators and interpreters should be looking for in terms of level of performance, and that's a useful addition to the CEFR. The CEFR doesn't have translation and interpreter specific. It has information on oral skills and writing skills in abundance, but doesn't have translator and interpreter specific descriptors, which the ILR does have. ILR is well established and mirrored by other systems, by NATO and the United Nations, but it does have associations with US federal agencies and military, so it's not so widely recognized in a UK or EU context, and not always recognized around the world. So just very briefly, the NATO STANAG 6001 scheme, which is strongly based on ILR, it's looked after by BILC, the Bureau for International Language Coordination, and they have a comprehensive website. And there are also some very straightforward and very easy to read and follow articulations of what you would be expecting at levels 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the NATO STANAG scheme. So they're very straightforward to understand and quite helpful in terms of understanding how language skills break out. So BILC and the NATO STANAG 6001 websites are quite useful resources. So moving on to the United Nations, similar to the ILR, draws extensively on the work of both CEFR, ILR, and other government institutions. So not surprisingly, given the UN's focus, heavily drawn upon the work of others, and obviously seeks to mirror and support it wherever possible. The United Nations framework is for their purposes, so it doesn't seek to or claim to be for any wider use. They're not promulgating it as a standard, but it is useful to be aware of, and it's a useful comparator because it comes from a neutral organization, which is of course very, very widely respected. 4 levels, 1, 2, 3, and 4, very similar to the ILR, doesn't have the level 5, which is effective fluency or native level skills, and it's used very, very widely in the UN to encourage and develop language competence within the UN, which is of course central to their purpose. Another standard that's perhaps less well known but worth being aware of is CSE, China's Standards of English Language Ability, and there's been a growing interest over the last decade in China in mapping test scores to language proficiency levels of different frameworks. So mapping the CSE, for example, onto the CEFR. Test scores can be used within educational or social contexts, and of course, these can have consequences for individuals, immigration, and other sorts of contexts. So it is important that when considering a test score, one is aware of the context, and it's also true that comparisons between different families of languages and different frameworks can have some nuances and differences, but nevertheless, as we'll look at in the coming slides, the CSE does map pretty straightforwardly onto some of the other frameworks we've been talking about. CSE is focused on use, so it takes a use-orientated approach and focuses on describing a person's real-world language ability rather than thinking of language as a static body of knowledge or something that someone does and then stops doing. So the CSE is very much about real-world contexts. So how does the CSE map to the CEFR? Well, CSE has 8 levels, and basically the level 8 of CSE maps onto what we were talking about earlier, that C1, C2 professional level. CSE 7 is a good, strong working level of competence, B2, C1 sort of level in the CEFR. CSE 6 is mainly around about B2, so again, working level but with some gaps, and then 4 and 5 are at those lower levels of the Bs. So that's a broad mapping of China's standards for English. IELTS, which is the International English Test, which many people will be aware of, not least because it's often a part of university entry. You can see how the CSE levels map onto IELTS there, and work has been done, quite detailed work to verify that mapping. So China's standards of English language ability do map, and it's useful to be aware of them. Finally then, slightly different from the other frameworks, but a thing to be aware of nonetheless, particularly in the context of translation work, is that ISO, the International Standards Organization, also has standards to do with languages. As I say, they're slightly different in their focus, in that they're less focused on individuals and their competences and more focused on quality assurance and how people in an organizational context should be taking into consideration standards and how they should be implementing them with their own workforces. So ISO 17100 deals with standards for translation and sets out the sorts of qualifications that you would expect a translator to have, and then the sorts of professional competences that you would be expecting from a translator in terms of their skills. So a bit of an outlier compared to the other standards, which are more focused on individuals and their own speaking, listening, reading, writing skills, but nevertheless worth being aware of, because ISO obviously is recognized worldwide, and these standards are part and parcel of assuring standards and quality in some language contexts, most notably translation. So in summary then, there is some genuine complexity in international standards and frameworks. There's a lot of detail that you can go into and can master. And there are also important differences between the frameworks. You know, in simple terms, in their numbering or lettering schemes, there are differences. And then there are also small nuances in their focus and also the way their descriptors vary. But it's important to say there are also very many similarities, and it's not difficult to make read acrosses between these frameworks. So I think it's useful to see the similarities and the read acrosses, because actually some of the value of understanding these frameworks is that we can talk to each other and understand each other's frameworks around the world and understand expectations and how they are used. So I would stress many similarities and many read acrosses. There are, of course, some cultural and sectoral biases and some linguistic biases in the way that those frameworks have been set up and what they were intended for. But I think these can be overcome to see through the differences, again, to recognise the similarities. So I would summarise by saying that international standards and frameworks have more that unites than divides them, and very, very useful to be aware of them. And again, just to say that on our website, we have a comprehensive setting out of these standards and also how they relate to our own qualifications, all of which are there to support, enable, and encourage people to be confident and to use their languages. That's the main focus here, to get people more confidence about their linguistic level and also working to improve it, because it's a life's work to improve and maintain languages. And if you know where you are on the journey, then that's encouraging and helps you get to the next level. What we want is a world with more people who can speak languages and more confident linguists, because that makes the world go around. Thanks for your time. Bye.